Hi, everyone. It's Zoe here from the EDGE team. I'm really excited to get a chance to lead this EDGEy staff conversation today, where we're going to have a bit of a chat about what does it look like to put people first, or what does people first look like for us as a team, but also just generally speaking, how do we be relationship based? How do we be relationship oriented in the way we live our lives and the kind of work that we do? We talked about it coming into today as it being really timely. We're sort of at a big shift in the pandemic, moving back to in-person ways of being with each other, and wondering what that means or how that's impacted the ways that we've been in relationship with each other over the last couple of years here. We also know, working with lots of new ministers and young folks that social media is a big deal. It's a way that people are in connection with each other often. And what does that look like, or what has that done to our ability to be people first with each other? So I'm excited to have the whole team with me today to share their ideas and thoughts around this. The first kind of question I'm curious to hear from folks, and I might start us off with this too, is where have we seen this? Where do we find people first in our daily lives or in our work? I think for me, just been really reflecting on that. I'm newer to the EDGE team, and it's just been really exciting and really fascinating to see the ways that people first is lived out with EDGE and the work that we do. I come from a background where folks really work quite independently. There's not a lot of collaboration. And so it's just been a whole different way of being. I'm still getting used to it, I feel like. It feels kind of foreign or a bit scary almost. And I think about that too in the context of COVID and getting back into relationship with people in person also feels a bit foreign and scary. So I'm just trying to work through that and embrace the vulnerability of being people first and of being in relationship. And it's been a pretty neat journey so far.
I love this. And thank you, Zoe. It's that I had never heard that from you until this moment, and just to know that it's so exuded. And so it's kind of like, how do you do what's people first, or putting people first? I'm like, how can you not in this work? But the question of where have you seen this? I was just thinking through two instances. One is kind of random. Southwest Airlines. If you've ever been, or WestJet, and you know how the flight attendants, and I guess what post-pandemic, I mean, this is kind of a good example, pre-pandemic, how funny it was and how many jokes they would pull on you, and all the things that would happen. And it was done in such a lighthearted way. And similarly, I was very privileged to get to go to Tibet. And it was Tibetans basically are pulling pranks on each other and laughing in the streets. And I just found it so beautiful in general. But then I was thinking, where else have I seen it? Because that had laughter and some joy to it. But I've also seen it in tears. I'm thinking during the pandemic, every 3 weeks or so, my girlfriends, my fellow alum, we actually get on Zoom together, on a Friday evening, and just share our experiences. And literally every other time we gather, there's our tears of the stress and the grief, and yet every single time we do that, it's just making space for each other. And so I think in the laughter and in the tears, it's both times is putting people first and being human together.
Yeah, I think people first is sort of self-explanatory, right? You put people before the agendas and before the items and before even the to-do lists, projects and stuff. But I think it actually is harder to do because we do have agendas and projects and to-do lists. And so it can be hard to put that aside sometimes, I think, and remember that we are, engaging with people or talking to people, having conversations, and each of us are bringing our own things that we probably haven't shared, right? There's other things on our hearts and our minds that haven't been explicitly shared. So for me, it's being really patient, and also remembering that people have all kinds of stuff happening that I am very likely not aware of. I think one of the examples that popped into my head was actually a job that I had in high school. And I had a really great boss that would, I was working with the public. I won't reveal the company, but I was working with the public, and I messed up. I didn't go by the policy. And my supervisor came over and rectified the situation. He was very okay, how can we fix this? It wasn't focused on my employee did this horrible thing. It was very much like, how do we improve this situation and get our way out of it? And then afterwards, we had a private conversation, just him and I, about how I should have dealt with it differently. And so I often think of that in engaging with people is, how do we best figure out the way to move forward so that the situation is dealt with, but not criticize or undermine people that are really probably had the best of intentions or certainly weren't trying to mess up. And so how, I don't know, I hope I find ways of doing that, but taking the time to really, it's easy to be critical of others. And then, I mean, I've obviously also messed up, so maybe we shouldn't focus too much on the mess ups, but rather find a way forward. So that's what I'll share for now.
Yeah, this is a great question, and thanks for those reflections. It's really, it's making my day in a way. There's a couple of ways I want to answer this question. One, I do remember when I was first settled in a 3-point rural pastoral charge in southwestern Ontario, the difference between my approach to ministry planning and the community's approach. And I had all kinds of ideas and goals, and and they would smile in the board meetings as I'm unfolding these ideas. They would sit there and all smile, and I would invite comment, and they would continue to sit there and smile. Complete silence. And I began to realize over time that what they were dealing with was a much more relational approach. They're not about the idea. They're about, how is so-and-so, how is this going to affect so-and-so? What is this going to mean for the 3 different charges? Like there's whole kind of, and you can't respond right away to that. You can't know that until the phone lines have buzzed quite a bit after the meeting before you say anything publicly, because it's relational, and relational is and I also experiences like I used to think they were kind of nosy. I would hear if Kelly put the garbage out without her shoes on. I'd hear about that. I said, like, think, mind your own business. But then I remember this one 86-year-old woman who was living alone didn't turn her bathroom light on at the right time. Her neighbor checks that. I might have called that nosy, except that she went over and she had fallen on the porch in the middle of a snowstorm and couldn't quite drag herself back in to the home. So she had kind of her head and so on in the front door, and the rest of her body. My first kind of hospital visit in a snowstorm after hearing about that. And then I realized what this is about. This is people watching out for one another. And depending on the person, it could get nosy, but that was a relational kind of approach. But I also want to talk about, because I think this is important, around where we don't see this, right? Like what this approach isn't. And that approach that I brought around planning, that organizational approach, we still largely have. The kind of KPIs, I'm not against, measuring stuff and so on, but when we take a portfolio approach to ministry, it's not relational. It's about another kind of goal. At least, it can be. The person can function that way, but the system is working against it. Some of the things that we've tried to do in EDGE, and it's so good to hear, is to shape the ministry based on the people and what they bring, as opposed to a structure and fit the people into it. And I know that's harder for large organizations. We've been given freedom to kind of experiment with that kind of thing. But I think it's really, really critical. It's not just effective for innovation. Like you really need that flexibility for innovation to keep things open. But I think it is ecclesiologically the point that it is the relationships that constitute reality for the Christian worldview. God is love.
I'm just like so inspired hearing all of this. And I think what's like really stood out for me is this sense of like not just like being oriented towards what's ahead of us or what's in the future, but like how do we like tend and nurture what's between us, and really build on this space in between us, and knowing that if we don't have those like in a stable place or really strong or really firm, that it's so much harder to do that like what's ahead of us work. And so if we can take a step back and say what's between us and how do we nurture it, how do we grow it, then we can get to a place where we can start to say, okay, now what's ahead of us.
Yeah, I think of so many of the conversations I think I've been having recently around capacity, our favorite word. How do we get so much done, and how do we, do all the things that we want to do? And as you know, Rob, although I've heard it oft quoted by many of our team, is we have to talk to the right people. Like if we don't feel we have the capacity for something, we haven't connected enough dots yet. And I find that a really helpful reminder, because I also just don't feel as alone in this. And it makes me think of, I have a good friend who runs a small business, and she was sort of at the end of her rope. Like she had done very successful things. She had staff, the business was doing well, but she was exhausted. And what she actually ended up doing was approaching a couple of her employees who had been employees for quite a while and said, can we redo how we do this? And actually brought them in as partners. And so some of the staff that had really helped build the business, she really invited into the management and the operations and organization. And so she wasn't doing it alone. And, surprise, surprise, these people had excellent ideas on how to also help things run more smoothly, so it wasn't as tiring. So like there was this whole reorganization and collaboration that really, opened up a whole new energy and life to that too. And so I think that I try to hold that story, and I have a few church examples too, where opening up those leadership and not feeling like you're alone in it, that also makes it very people first, because people also have other ideas and understandings of how to engage well. So
I love that story. It's so perfect, because really this, like, how would you know that you're people first? So what would it feel like? Your example is that she had to be vulnerable, right? She had to be courageous in doing that. She had to like let go of control. And so I think in that liminal space of deciding to change yourself to be people first, what a leap of faith that moment is. I think. And then it was interesting because you would expect that she might get more tired, but it became life-giving when she let go of that control. And so how would you know that you're putting people first? And what was neat about that example, Bronwyn, I was hearing, is that it actually just had this upward spiral afterwards, right? What did it mean is that she actually became one of the best places to work. And obviously, like we've talked about before, like, well, yeah, by putting people first is making this the best place to be, and the best neighborhoods and like vibrant neighborhoods is actually putting people first all the time. But it feels risky at first, but I think it's most likely more risky not to do it.
I was taking notes, but I want to come in. A couple things. One of when you talked about the transformation, right? And that's one of the things that people first looks like. You've got to be willing to do the interpersonal work, because what motivation matters, right? The same activity can be relational or something else, depending on the motivation. So congregations often wrestle with this problem of getting bums in pews, right? When getting bums in pews is about sustaining the church because you're fearful for the budget, that's manipulation. That's kind of taking advantage, trying to use people's need for spiritual community and grounding to fix your budget. But it's also true that the church has something precious for people in the world right now. That sense of surrender you were talking about, and I heard someone talk about they're really afraid of, really terrified in dog sledding because this lack of control, right? That's the other thing about people first. You don't have control, you have connection. Bronwyn, you were saying this. The good news is we're not alone. We never have control. That's just an illusion. But if we're not in relationship, we can pretend that we have control. If we put relationship first, we know for sure we don't have control. So, you know, if we're looking for a way to actually give people the spiritual thing that they're craving, then that could look like bums and pews, depending on what's happening in the pews or what people need that are in that community. But it's a total different motivation. We knew early on in EDGE's work that relationship's critical to the work that we're doing. We hired someone who's now working almost full time for the sole reason to connect one-on-one with congregations day after day after day after day. Every congregation, every community of faith in the United Church, over and over time, because it's so critical. And we knew that because we did the consultation for the Comprehensive Review Task Group, we knew that United Church congregations across all kinds of sectors and differences, rural, urban, small, large, they share a vision. They just don't feel connected. Somehow the structures were not helping them feel that relational piece, that they were part of the larger body. And so, you know, trying to weave that connectional fabric that helps the church feel like a body, help the parts work together, that Paul was striving for with some of those images. And it takes longer sometimes. Sometimes it's faster because it is abundance. When you do relation first, like Bronwyn was saying, find the right partner, whatever it is, you find there's more on the table than you need to do what you thought you were striving and didn't have enough to do. But it can seem to take longer initially because you have to build the relationship. It takes time. Change happens at the pace of trust. So this is such a good topic. Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks, Rob. I think, you know, you've led us quite beautifully, I think, into sort of my next wondering, and I've heard strains of it throughout everyone's comments of like this sense of courage, of vulnerability, of trust, of really being together. And so I think this, you know, kind of pushes us to ask this question of like, what does this mean? What does it mean for us in our personal lives? What does it mean in our work? What does it mean in the way that we relate to one another? And I think what's really stood out for me is this sense of, and you know, we had a conversation, I think it was last week sometime, and I heard a similar thing, this sense of like relationship is valuable just for the sake of being in relationship. You know, it doesn't need to be the means to an end. We don't need to use relationship as a way to get somewhere. And I heard strains of that too, in this sense around like bums and pews and what does that mean? But like we can value and hold relationship sacred just for being that exact thing. And I think when I have that lens, like all of my way of being shifts at work, in my home life, everywhere, because then everything else that happens after that is it just is. And some of it will be good and some of it will be bad and some of it will be neutral. But if I hold the relationship central and just value it for exactly what it is, then everything else kind of opens up for me about how I do things.
Shockingly, I have actually been with EDGE for 10 years, a decade. And I would say in this time, I continue to see how putting people first in my role with EDGE, but in all my life has actually been so life-giving. Become a better partner, better stepmother, better family member, better friend, right? So better in all that I'm doing because I really see people with new eyes. I think to be a little bit boring, I might just bring it into something concrete on the innovation side. So a lot of churches are exploring social innovation and some of this idea about social enterprise. Well, if we're actually putting people first in all that we do, this should be really, really easy stuff. Because social enterprise usually is a for-profit business model, but putting social impact first. And so really, if people are first and foremost, and relationship is first and foremost, we actually turn our clients in a social enterprise into people. They're not its, right? They become people, and we really look at them and care about them. And so when that happens, really, by putting people first, we're going to be able to do social enterprise and social innovation even better, which has ripple effects of changing the world. So it's like small, so boring, but not boring. Of when you start doing that and start seeing it in smaller contexts in your neighborhood, how it keeps on actually having bigger ripple effects out there. But I think there's a lot of possibility for communities of faith of when you have that, what does that mean in the other work that you're doing in your neighborhood?
Yeah, I think that that's really helpful. And I think it does come back to like, we still want to do things, right? Like, I think that there's this impression if we just focus on people that maybe we won't be doing all of the things, and that's somehow the better, the better part. It makes me think of Mary and Martha, right? Where, is the better part serving all the guests, or is it sitting in the middle of the group and listening to Jesus talk and trying to, learn about this crazy ministry he's starting. And I think that's, yeah, so I mean, I think we can all probably get caught in that. And I think of congregations who, are really struggling to keep their buildings or keep a program that they've had going, or something. And not always, but often when we dig down into that conversation in those relationships, it's relational, right? They want to be in that building because they have memories of engaging with people in that building, or important things happened, like they got married in that building, or something like that. So I think when we can unearth some of those things too, and there is a grieving process to any of these sort of practical matters, or there can be, but often, what's crucial is the relationships that have been built in a community and the desire to keep that relationship building network possible. So that might not be how anybody would phrase it, but that's what I see, is that there's an urgent desire to keep a congregation alive in a community, so that there is that place in the community that people can connect and find spiritual grounding and practice and community. I think I've already said that. And so I think that that's a challenge, and I can think of a group I was meeting with just the other week that really identified a whole bunch of relational pieces, and then was like, but we have to do these repairs on our building first. And it raised the question of like, is that what you need to do next, right? Like, do you need to spend 2 years raising $100,000 to repair this building? Is that actually what you want to be doing? So sometimes yes, but sometimes that's not the relational piece first, right? You don't necessarily need that building or that boiler or roof or whatever it is. So it's tough though. It can be hard to let go. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the it's tough piece too, because one of the things about relationship first is that it is profoundly countercultural in a post-Enlightenment society. Enlightenment is based on kind of an objective worldview where we focus on and value objects and a kind of narrow kind of logic. And sometimes people get kind of left out of that. And so to change that very, very core approach can be very threatening. And that's when it gets hard. And that's when the relational approach is also hard. And I think some of the places where EDGE has learned, some of the costs of a relational approach, when people are triggered by the change work that we do, and it feels like for and against, us and them, to how to pull out to that third way that can make space for relationship to deepen in that struggle. and we've talked about that, but we haven't always lived that out in the deepest way. And that's, but it's critical because I think the survival of the planet depends on it. And Carla, you started to hint at some of the systemic issues involved with this. And actually, it was just some of the follow-up from the Hopeful Economics Unconference and coming across the donut economics idea. And if you picture at the center and rays going out, kind of measures of basic human, things that are necessary for human thriving, like, basic physical needs, dignity, not marginalized, anti-racist, all these kind of criteria and so there's a minimum circle where you have to kind of meet a threshold in order for people to thrive. That's kind of a relational people first approach. And then it can grow, right? But on the outer ring is this limit in terms of capacity of the earth and ecological considerations. So there's this, free market is a fantastically transformative process. Havana became self-sufficient for food in 1 year when the Soviet Union collapsed and they couldn't get oil. They couldn't transport food. They became food self-sustaining in Havana in 1 year because they allowed individuals to take on a free market. Every alleyway became a chicken run. Every lawn became a garden. Like that, right? But these limits in order to sustain the people first. And the market it can be a wonderfully people first place in that range, because it is about the exchange of gifts. It is abundance. It's people exchanging their value, their God-given unique kind of contribution to the universe, and sharing it so that we all have enough. That's the whole idea of tithing. God is generous and provides so that we can share what comes out of it so that all can have enough. That's the basic Exodus economic framework. And we don't save it up all, in big piles. We share it around. Anyway, that's we have to experiment with those systemic ways of how we live that out.
Thanks, Rob. I'm thinking as we bring our conversation towards a close here today, about what it's been like to have this conversation about being people first within the context of our relationship as a team. So like, what has this experience of being people first while talking about people first been like? Which I know I can see the smiles and laughter, but I'm curious to know what's it been like. And I can say, really briefly for me, I had this moment and I was like, oh, people first isn't just something the EDGE team says. Like, this is something we live out. And so when I jump on a Zoom call or when someone calls me to check in and they ask, how was my weekend? Or what are you up to? They're actually asking, like, how was my weekend? How are you? Not just as an inquiry of something we have to say before we can move on to work talk or shop talk. So I think that's really solidified this for me and being part of this conversation today. So I'm grateful to all of you for that moment and that experience.
Thanks, Zoe. And you always have very exciting weekends. I think what was really fun for me in this is just watching each of us starting to tell our stories. And it was really funny to see, we all started like, okay, we're having this conversation. And then we all started to smile a little bit. And then I noticed we all kind of leaned forward a little bit more and just hearing each other's stories and really listening. And the other part for me was just how different each of our responses to the questions have been. And that, I think, that's what's important, is that we don't necessarily agree. We're all coming from different places on these questions, and yet we're really interested in what the other person has to say and what that could mean together.
Yeah, I think what's so crucial is listening and taking the time to really be present, which I'm not going to say I'm perfect at, right? Like, it's an ongoing, every meeting, it's like, right, pay attention, be in this moment, don't check your email, don't do the, like, it can be really easy to get distracted. And so I think that's an ongoing work in progress. And I always think of a previous colleague of mine who, I was stressing about how we were going to put this new thing in place and how we were going to make it work. And how do I follow these like guidelines that have been laid out for me and stuff. And he was like, call me. Like, and I was like, oh, right. We can still have a conversation, right? Like we'd made a plan together, and it's not like that meant one of us had to just go off and do it. It was like, when you run into trouble, give me a call. And, I can think of numerous projects with all three of you that I'm looking at right now where things have not gone the way we expected. So the best laid plans didn't work that way, but rather than panicking and feel like we had to force that, which sometimes I feel like I have to do, you say, wait a second, no, we have to actually, what I have to do is call Zoe and say, I don't think this is going to work the way we thought it was. How do we make it work? And then maybe we even would bring in other people too, right? Realizing that maybe we can't just do it, the two of us. So I think that's, I feel in this conversation too, making space for each other as well as listening.
I'm aware that the change that's happened over time, and that I think the passion of people on the team for innovation, for finding new ways ahead, and for responding to the creative spirit forces us to be like that. Vulnerability forces us to learn to be people first and relational, because you can't do it alone. You can't sustain it alone. Increasingly, early on, there were times where I'd fear to bring things to the team. Now I just crave the moment when I can bring things to the team. The loss of control becomes the strength of us versus we versus I, right? And knowing that we won't disagree, right? And that's the good part, because that's diversity, that's abundance. But now, having had that journey, and the team has changed, but somehow the culture has just continues to deepen. And for someone like you, Zoe, to come in and kind of just recognize that and value it right off the bat. And you too, Bronwyn, didn't you start like this year or something? What? It was last year. Yeah, COVID kind of annihilates time. But the privilege of being a part of this team and experiencing the relationships with you people is one of the greatest privileges, maybe the greatest privilege and joy for me that I've had in ministry. And yeah, I can't express what that means to me.
I don't know I could end us off with a better sentiment than what you gave there, Rob, the strength of we versus I. So with that, we will say goodbye for today's conversation. Grateful for all the folks who are here today and looking forward to more conversations just like this one. Thanks, everyone.